Welcome to World Wood Day 2022 Fire in the West. My name is Steve Ambrose and I'm a retired U.S. Forest Service employee who volunteers for the International Wood Culture Society, who sponsors World Wood Day. The International Wood Culture Society brings people together all over the world to discuss wood and the culture of wood. In the last few decades, wildfire in the United States has become an increasing problem. It has caused destruction of not only our forests and our resources such as water, air, soil, and wildlife, but property and lives as well. If you study the graph displayed here, you can see that although the number of fires has actually decreased, the severity and the acreage burned has increased. Since the 1990s, the average annual acres burned by wildfire in the U.S. has doubled in size to about 7 million acres per year. In cooperation with the Rocky Mountain Research Station of the Forest Service, the International Wood Culture Society is developing videos to help explain what's happening in the West. Today, we will begin discussing aspen's relation to wildfire and forest management. Now, let me introduce our participants in the panel today. Jessica Bruin is the Science Delivery and Public Affairs Specialist for the Rocky Mountain Research Station. Momo Shaw is the video editor and program coordinator for the International Wood Culture Society. And today we have three special guests with expertise in aspen ecosystems and management. Dr. Stanley Kitchen is a research botanist, conducts research on historical and current disturbances, processes, and their effects on shrubland, woodland, and forest ecosystems of the Intermountain region. He is a recently retired U.S. Forest Service employee for the Rocky Mountain Research Station and is located in Provo, Utah. Dr. Paul Rogers is a professor in the College of Natural Resources at Utah State University. He is the director of the Western Aspen Alliance, a joint venture between Utah State University, Bureau of Land Management, and the USDA Forest Service. The overall goal of the Western Aspen Alliance is to facilitate effective and appropriate management of aspen ecosystems in Western North America through coordinated scientific efforts and shared information. Our third panelist today is Dr. Wayne Shepard, who is a research scientist retired from the Rocky Mountain Research Station in 2007. As an occasional forestry consultant, he provides clients with knowledge and expertise on factors and processes responsible for the structural development of both conifer and aspen forest types. He develops alternative management strategies to meet many diverse resource objectives for clients, including both private landowners as well as state and federal resource managers. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. Paul, I'll turn the video over to you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Paul Rogers. I'm here today to talk about aspen ecology and fire with my honored colleagues, Stan Kitchen and Wayne Shepard. It's truly a pleasure to work with them and alongside them. I think you'll enjoy this talk today as our expertise complement each other quite well. We want to first give you a little background on Aspen Basics, the basics of ecology, and then I'll pass the baton on to Stan Kitchen. He'll talk about fire regimes and time. And then on to Wayne, who will talk about restoration efforts with fire in aspen ecosystems. Finally, we'll come back to Stan with adaptive management, and then I'll talk briefly about aspen futures and some things to think about as we sign off and then have a discussion afterwards. Before we get started, it strikes me that some people in the audience may not know the importance of aspen. So aspen in the Western US particularly is valuable for its biodiversity, forage, water conservation, and particularly aesthetics. Around the world, there's some of these same values with about 6 aspen species. So it's a very important species, but not in the traditional timber sense, but many other uses for what's known as quaking aspen in this part of the world. So I like to start out talking about Aspen Basics or the aspen ecology by saying that aspen is a beautiful thin-skinned fire-loving clone. And then I have the ... the pause there, except when it isn't. So my mode of operation here will be to talk about traditional aspen ecology and then some things that we've learned differently that kind of counteract that. The rule of thumb is to keep your eyes open and to always look for new changes in information as they come up. First of all, that thin skin part. Aspen bark is very thin, and underneath there's a rich chlorophyll layer. And many wildlife species, as well as insects, really like to get into that layer for its nutritious value. This is an example of Rocky Mountain elk rubbing and chewing on mature aspen trees. And this slide here is an example of a western sapsucker. It's a bark penetrating bird, a woodpecker that tries to get at insects and leaves that distinct horizontal pattern. But they're all trying to get into that chlorophyll layer or the insects that reside in there. These openings in aspen provide a vector for various diseases. And this is an important part of aspen. Aspen is not a long-lived species. It grows and lives and dies in a relatively short cycle compared to its conifer partners in the forest. But that thin skin allows for a lot of decay in the interior of the tree and easy penetration and habitation by cavity nesting birds. And there's a whole series of primary, secondary, and tertiary cavity nesting birds that use this quality of thin bark as an asset to build their nests inside the trees. The thin skin is also affected by sun. First of all, the reflectivity of the bark, you could think of it as the whiteness of it, reflects more or less, and that's tied to the genetic makeup of the particular aspen clone. I'll return to that term in a minute. However, when the trees are really exposed, they can get sun scald, which is another vector for disease. And finally, our prime target of discussion today is fire. The thin skin on aspen is easily penetrated even by low-level fires moving across the forest floor, and actually whole forests can be killed by these low-level fires. So the traditional crown fire is not necessary to kill mature aspen. Most of us have seen burnt over areas, but if there's aspen present, particularly in abundance prior to a fire, you see this very rich sprouting, or what's known as suckering in aspen. It's vegetative resprouting from the root systems. And aspen trees hold an advantage over trees growing from seed because the underground engine of roots is packed and ready to go, and it can just explode with new growth soon after a fire. This happens to be 1 year after a fire in western Wyoming, and you see the abundance of tall aspen suckers coming up there from the root system, even when the entire overstory is killed. However, and this is the exception, some aspen don't burn very well. And you'll notice there's a lack of conifers in this particular stand in the eastern part of Wyoming. And these are not very flammable environments. And so aspen, yes, it's very flammable. Yes, it influences the ecology of the species. However, there's kind of an alternative cohort, you might say, of aspen stands that are not very flammable. And it happens sort of on a continuum, as you see in this graph and is documented in this review paper on aspen fire ecology that came out about 10 years ago. But in a sense, we divide aspen roughly into stable and cereal aspen. Those in the pink are different aspen systems happening at different elevations in a mix with 1 to 5 conifer species. And their flammability varies as well as the periodicity of the fire. In the lower part there, the stable aspen types very rarely see fire, only under certain conditions like the last picture I showed there, and it's not really a major component of the ecology of that system. One more important aspect I'd like to highlight here is that whole deal about aspen being a clone. If you're not familiar with that term, this is the famous Pando aspen clone in central Utah, and it's thought to be the largest living thing on Earth by dry weight mass. It's about 43 hectares or 106 acres in size, but we distinguish a clone visually often by a different coloration between this aspen stand and those surrounding it. In this case, you can see in early autumn, some of the stands surrounding there have turned yellow already, but the Pando clone, all one living organism, genetically identical stems, is still in green foliage. However, here's our kind of exception, or at least some new coming evidence here. On the left there, you see a sucker growing from the roots that I described in that fire photo a couple of photos ago. And on the right is a true aspen seedling. Thought to be a rare event, we're now finding these more and more commonly after fire. So here's another element or dimension that we're adding to the aspen fire story. And basically, this is something we're just beginning to learn about, so stay tuned on that front. And I should just point out that on the right, a new seedling is a new genotype or a new clone starting out. Finally, I'd like to talk about sort of, you might call traditional aspen succession. And I've just put some photos up there, starting at time 0 on the left with a recent burn about 10 years after a fire. The next photo, 20 years after a fire, something like 60 to 80 years after a fire, and then 100 or more years after a fire. You see that succession takes place. This is nothing new, and our graph there shows aspen dominating at first with a black line, and then somewhere along that hypothetical chart from 0 to 100 years, conifers often take over. And remember, this is in the serial, not in the stable aspen type. A critical message I'd like to convey is that there are many, many species dependent on aspen ecosystems. It has some of the highest biodiversity of any forest systems in the Western US. And as goes that trend in aspen, if conifers take over, so logically goes all of those species who are dependent on aspen ecosystems. So that's my 1, 2, 3 of basic aspen ecology. And I'm going to pass the baton over to my colleague, Stan Kitchen.
Thank you, Paul. That was an excellent introduction of aspen as a species, the community ecosystem in which it thrives, and certainly an excellent introduction to its relationship with fire. My intent and purpose at this time is to talk a little bit about fire regimes and how they relate to aspen communities. I'll start with some basic principles. Fire regimes are generally thought of in terms of, as we know, not a single fire, but how fire plays out across the landscape through time. It's certainly not one event or even one simple pattern necessarily. We oftentimes think in terms of fire frequency, or how often do we see fire on a particular landscape. It can be a very high frequency, in some cases a matter of a few years in between fire events, and on the other end of the scale are low frequency, where many decades to hundreds of years in between fire events. Another measure of that fire regime is fire severity, or the impact it has on the ecosystem. And again, that can be quite low. A low intensity fire can oftentimes produce low impacts on the ecosystem. Then other ways of thinking about the fire regime are how large are the fires, how continuous, the seasonality of fires, the regularity of fires, even the pattern across the landscape, how those fires might burn. So we tend to group fire regimes by high frequency, low severity, or low frequency and high severity. And sometimes we even address a more complicated system in which we collect them into what is commonly called a mixed severity fire regime, where across space, any particular fire might have various levels of severity. And through time, there may be short intervals and longer intervals, all in a more complex setting. And in fact, that is mixed severity fire regimes tend to be more common than we often admit. The drivers or regulators of how frequent a fire is, how severe a fire is, how large a fire might become, the primary drivers are fuels, weather, and ignitions. And just briefly, when I'm talking about fuels, I'm talking about the type of fuel, the rate of fuel production, and the frequency and duration in which those fuels become flammable, or we call conditioning, dry enough that they will easily ignite and burn. Jump to ignitions, we're talking about both the quantity, the frequency of ignitions, be they human caused, both accidental and intentional, as well as natural ignitions, primarily through lightning. And is the timing of those ignitions, does it occur when those fuels are in a condition when they can burn? And finally, under weather, I'm primarily talking about the probability or timing of severe fire weather when ignitions and fuel are such that fires can take place. Severe fire weather being low humidity, high wind speeds, high temperatures, and those conditions can set up for rapid fire spread and extreme fire conditions. So if I focus just on one of those aspects, just the fuels part, as we talk about aspen, we can see quickly, even in stable aspen, or sometimes called persistent or pure aspen, where there are few, if any, conifers present. In the top 3 photos on the screen here, we see examples of very different understory. One is a perennial grass understory. One is dominated by perennial forbs, and a third by shrub species. And each of those creates a different fuel matrix, different fuel conditions that will affect the timing of when fire is likely to occur if there's an ignition, and how that fire might behave, how severe it impacts, how intense a fire, and even the patchiness. Now, if we add in conifers, which can vary in terms of their size, density, and species from across the successional gradient from few to many, and then finally dominating, as Paul so well explained earlier, depending on the time since the last disturbance, then the contribution of those conifers, which are much more flammable, to the probability of fire and the behavior of that fire makes the whole interpretation of fire regime a bit more complex. We have ladder fuels now, and in later stages, we have very flammable crown fuels that will very much alter the behavior of the fire and how that fire is expressed and the impacts on the ecosystem that follow. So what I've spent a fair amount of my career doing is looking at if we can understand what fire regimes are consistent with aspen persistence and aspen ecosystem resilience, then perhaps we can mimic that both in terms of management and how we direct successional processes in order to have the most resilient and beneficial circumstances on the landscape. A way to do that is to look at fire regimes historically or in the past over multiple centuries and match those with the aspen condition that we see today. And a way of doing that is to use tree ring evidence or dendrochronology. That's a process that's used in many forest types throughout the world, less so with aspen because aspen often do not survive fire. And we're looking for injuries in the tree ring that are detectable and assignable to a particular year so that we can look at both temporal and spatial patterns of fire. We get around this problem with aspen that way by looking at the conifers that co-occur with aspen. And we see here in these two pictures, two examples. On the left is a ponderosa pine snag in which the base you see where injuries occurred, and a sample, sometimes called a cookie, it's a partial cross-section, is being removed to examine where those injuries occur within the annual growth rings. And on the right, it's also, in this case, in a mixed conifer aspen forest and a stump. And both these cases illustrate they don't have to be living trees in order to recover, and samples that can be used for creating these fire chronologies that can oftentimes be multi-centuries in length. As a result, we take those samples, they are surfaced so that we can clearly see annual growth rings and assess the pattern of fire over time on that point in the landscape. And I have here two examples that I'd like to look at quickly. They were both taken from the same watershed, a few kilometers apart, I believe 4 or 5 kilometers distance from each other. And on the left is a live ponderosa pine tree with fire scars indicating that this tree experienced and survived surface fire on the ground, not in the canopy. The first being in 1740, the last in 1934, with only the one fire after 1860. So a fairly regular pattern of fire from 1740 to 1860, and then only one fire after that period of time. This is 10 fires in that period of time with a mean fire interval or average period of time without fire of about 15.6 years. A little distance away, like I indicated before, from a snag was taken this sample. On the right, a little higher in elevation, it recorded 7 fires between 1696 and 1879. So a longer mean fire interval of 30.5 years in this mixed conifer setting. Altogether, there are 16 years in which fire were recorded between these two trees. Again, they're in the same watershed, a little distance apart, and they only recorded fire in 1 year in common, that being 1813. This suggests that, and several other samples that were taken in different locations in this watershed, that most fires were relatively small and burned in small areas in an Apache way. And occasionally there were larger fires that were recorded across longer distances in the same year within the same watershed. So that's a way that we can learn something about the spatial distribution as well as the temporal distribution of fire. That, and in this case, a landscape, a good portion of it, aspen is present and often dominant. This is another case taken from another site in southern Utah in the United States, as was the prior example. This picture was taken in 1996. And what I want to do with this is to illustrate how repeat photography can also inform this desire to learn about past fire regimes and their effects on vegetation. So here we're at almost 3,000 meters elevation. There's aspen, a variety of sizes, and subalpine fir from small to medium in size on this particular site, with some limited amount of understory and fuels on the ground as well. This next picture was taken from the same location, or very close to the same location, 124 years earlier in 1872. It's fortunate to be able to have some of these older photos, and we can see quite different vegetation pattern. There are essentially no conifers, except we can see a few on the ridge in the background. Those are Douglas fir, not the subalpine fir. And there are a few other Douglas fir scattered around this little lake in different places. And fortunately, we were able to collect fire scar samples from 7 of those Douglas fir trees and reconstruct a tree ring based fire history for this little basin that's visible in this picture. Of those 7 trees, there was fire recorded in 13 years, starting in 1708, ending in 1869. Incidentally, that was just 3 years. The last fire was just 3 years before this picture was taken. There were 4 years in which we deduced that there were larger fires based on the fact that multiple trees in this viewscape recorded fire in different locations in the same year. Based on just those 4 years of fire, we assessed that this particular area experienced fire on approximately every 35 to 40 years on average during the 200-year plus period that we have record. It's important to note that the last fire was that 1869, and there's been no evidence of fires since on this landscape. So to summarize, I want to make 4 points. First, that historical aspen fire regimes were highly variable. That variability is due to differences in fuels, weather, and ignition patterns. Because aspen occurs across quite a varied landscape, geographically and different soils types, elevationally, and so forth, we would expect to see quite a lot of variability in the fire regime. The second point being that mixed severity fire regime that I described earlier, where the fire severity and fire frequency varies tremendously spatially and through time, is probably the dominant type. At least that's the opinion that I would have. In this upper picture, we see the consequences of that, where a real mosaic of vegetation types, areas where conifer is dominant, areas where aspen is dominant, and various stages of succession reflecting a variable disturbance regime pattern in the past. A third point would be that many aspen landscapes have experienced less fire in the 20th century, last 120 or even 150 years than has been recorded in previous centuries based upon the evidence that we have. And because of that reduce or less fire, my fourth point would be the vegetation in modern aspen landscapes is more homogenized, with an overrepresentation of these late seral forest conditions with heavy fuel loads, which now lead to more severe fire in the last few decades, as Steve pointed out so well earlier. So with that, I will pass to Wayne.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. Stan and Paul have described many of the unique attributes of aspen in the Western United States and its adaptations to fire, including the ability to regenerate by root sprouting. Now I'd like to share some research results and observations on how prescribed fire can be used to restore aspen forest. There are really 3 crucial factors needed to successfully regenerate aspen through root sprouting, whether it be done naturally or whether it be done through intervention and treatment. I like to refer to them as the aspen regeneration triangle. First, buds on aspen roots near the soil surface must be stimulated to grow new aspen sprouts. This occurs when auxin hormones produced by parent trees can no longer reach the roots. This can result from parent tree death or the severing of roots extending away from the parent tree. Fire can accomplish both of these. Second, a favorable growth environment for sprout growth must be provided. Ideally, this would be full sunlight on the soil surface and reduce competition from other plants. Again, fire can provide these conditions. And third, it's necessary to carefully monitor the sprouts that do come up to ensure that they are protected from excessive animal browsing. Under natural situations where large areas burned in the past, this occurred naturally. But today, if we're trying to regenerate aspen that is a small component of the landscape, or where animal populations are extremely high and use is heavy, we would have to add more direct protection, either fencing or other direct methods to control animals' access to the sprouts. Now, Paul and Stan described a lot about fire and its relationship to aspen. I would like to go into a little more detail and describe the types of fire that affect aspen and how then we might use them in a prescribed manner to restore aspen forests. Crown fires, as Stan described, usually burn through an aspen conifer mixed forest where the conifers carry the fire. These types of fires generate a lot of heat and move fairly quickly through the forest. And under normal fuel loadings on the surface, they can provide those conditions that Paul showed us that result in these very successful sprouting events. Now, fire can also burn through non-forested or other aspen vegetation complexes, such as the sage aspen complex we see here, and regenerate aspen. This is a prescribed fire that was done in Western Colorado years ago that resulted in the successful regeneration of these aspen groves, small aspen groves that existed on this site. You can see the blue area here outlines the apron, if you will, of new sprouts that were created when the fire moved through this area. You'll notice that the area outlined in blue occupies a larger area than the area occupied by the original grove. And this means that you can then actually expand the area of aspen on a landscape in this method. And that's because the lateral roots that sprout extend quite a ways away from the parent trees. However, there's a complication if fuel loadings are extremely heavy and you have a lot of logs lying on the soil surface. Such would happen after a commercial timber harvest, or if there were piling done to reduce fuel loadings in areas, or if a forest had very heavy loading of large logs on the soil surface, probably 120 tons per acre or more. The results can be similar to those that happened when we burned a study site of mine in Western Colorado that had extreme fuel loading. And you can see that at the end of 5 years, we had no aspen sprouts, where prior to this time, there was an aspen mixed conifer forest. So these are situations that have to be avoided when you're using fire to regenerate aspen. But as we'll see, there might be some ways around that. Now, combining prescribed fire with mechanical treatment also has some benefit. Here are some results from a study of mine in Arizona, where we first mechanically treated an aspen mixed conifer forest to remove the competing conifers and some of the aspen that were in poor condition, and then fenced the entire area. And then immediately after the commercial or the mechanical treatment, we burned the area with a light surface fire. This was prior to the initial sprouting event that occurred the next growing season. You can see here that as we monitored that over the next 5 years, we got considerably more sprouts in the area that was mechanically treated and burned than the area that was unburned and just mechanically treated, and wound up with essentially twice as many sprouts at the end of the study. And not only did we have greater numbers of sprouts, but those sprouts grew at a more rapid rate, resulting in significantly taller sprouts at the end of the monitoring period in this study. We attribute that partially to the warming effect during the first growing season following the fire that was caused in the soil by the blackened surface that the fire left. We monitored that with varied temperature sensors through the first growing season down to depths of 15 centimeters. And you can see we got significantly warmer soil temperatures, which undoubtedly affected the ability of the sprouts to establish and grow. In addition to this, the removal of competing understory vegetation, which was grass in this particular case, probably benefited from, the sprouts benefited from that. And the ash left following the fire probably added a fertilization effect to come up with these results. Now, applying prescribed fire in aspen can mimic each of these ways that Stan described. Prescribed crown fire has been used for a couple of decades in the Western United States and has resulted in creating patterns on larger landscapes, mimic that mixed mode characteristic that Stan described. This is from one of the earliest of those burns in southern Utah, where they ignited patches of forest that were mixed conifer aspen. The fire carried through these forests, these patches by the conifers. And when it hit the pure aspen, it dropped to a surface fire and was easily suppressed. And the result then is that patchy mixed mode landscape pattern that Stan described existed in the past. Now, surface fire can also be used to regenerate pure aspen forests. Even a very light surface fire like this one can have a positive benefit by blackening the soil, by killing at least a few of the trees. If fuel loadings are more intense or the vegetation type is some of those more heavier shrubby types that Stan showed us, you can get a complete mortality of the overstory and starting a new fire. These are new forest. These fires can be more safely applied in areas where there is infrastructure present or other attributes that need to be protected, and you have a better chance of controlling the fire in those smaller areas. Now, I mentioned that, again, under some circumstances, you can burn fuels, heavy fuels loadings, and still get aspen. This is a study that we did in southern Colorado, where we first logged the site, which was an aspen mixed conifer forest with a commercial timber sale, which left a lot of slash on the ground, as you see here, with some heavy fuels, some heavy logs there. We ignited this fire in the spring just after snowmelt, when the soils were saturated and when there was plenty of moisture in the large diameter fuels, and they did not ignite. The result was that we got a very successful sprouting event in the areas that were burned. And this lasted initially for a few years, but we neglected to fully appreciate the last leg of the aspen regeneration triangle and didn't adequately provide protection for animals. And the result is that areas that were exposed to animals were completely devoid of sprouts at the end of 5 years. So this brings up the point of how do you successfully plan for doing aspen restoration, and what factors do you need to consider when doing it? And Paul and Stan will now show us some of those things.
Thank you, Wayne. That was an excellent introduction to how to bring fire back into many of these forest types in a responsible kind of a way, which leads right into what I would like to share at this time and building upon your excellent presentation. Much of the problem that we have still in Western North America in the use of fire, intentional fire, is the public perception of the dangers and the negative consequences that can come about, or our inability to control fire once it starts. Again, this particular picture here is of a prescribed burn. It's a pretty intense burn. I would note that it was in November, well into the fall, and so at a time where the fire was controlled and kept within the prescription very well. But to look at this kind of a blaze, and for the general public, this can be a bit disconcerting. There are many issues that affect our ability and the appropriateness of using or allowing fire in aspen management and restoration, as Wayne so well described. I just would touch on a few others. The effects of smoke, especially near high population areas, can be a factor that determines when you can burn and how brief or open your burn windows might be. The potential effects on important watersheds, sometimes a very delicate watershed in terms of how they affect stream function, water quality, downstream fishery habitats. Those are also can be major concerns. Another area of concern is land ownership. We work with a lot of publicly owned lands, both federal and state lands, that may have different approaches to how they want to manage those lands, but also private holdings, and the private landowners have to be involved in the process of when and how fire might be used as a treatment option. On top of that, we have different stakeholders with conflicting values of how these lands might be managed and what the priority uses might be. These might include hunting for big game, livestock grazing, recreational values, wilderness values. Of course, I already mentioned watershed, wildlife habitat, including that needed for at-risk species, and the list goes on. That makes this whole process of dealing with reintroducing fire at large scales to where it can be quite complicated. On top of that, we have to be humble enough to admit that we don't always know what the results are going to be or how weather is going to play out. We think we have a pretty good handle on animal numbers or fuel loading, and sometimes things turn out a little bit different than we expected. So we have to be willing to actively learn as we go, and that comes to this title of adaptive management. That's what we're talking about, is learning as we go from every opportunity. And to be able to do that, we have to have data. We have to be able to see the results of the decisions that have been made in the past, and that requires a robust monitoring program almost always. Now, I want to talk about this particular question. Did you get what you expected? In 4 different cases, and this shows the importance of that monitoring and adjusting expectations and adjusting what we do to get the right results. In the top left-hand corner is a picture 2 years after fire. We've seen a few of these already, thanks to both Paul and Wayne, where there was a pretty significant fire, in this case, a patch of high severity fire. This is 2 years after, and the aspen and the understory are all doing pretty well. This stand is well on its way to recovery. Usually takes more than 2 years to get to the point that you feel that you're comfortable that the aspen will recover, but this is at least well on its way. On the other hand, on the top right-hand corner is a site that was also a wildfire, and someone had the presence to put in a few small exclosures to keep both domestic and wild ungulates from eating the aspen. In this case, it was primarily elk, but some mule deer and cattle that would be the animals that would be eating the suckers. This is some years after the fire, but within a few years, aspen was completely lost on this site, except where it had that kind of protection. So not only did we lose aspen, but we lost a forest community with the associated productivity, biodiversity, and watershed capacity that forested system would have been able to provide. Third example on the lower left is, again, this was a prescribed fire. And in this case, a couple years after the fire, in most, very little aspen is surviving. Here, there's a little bit of aspen that had some protection growing underneath a down log, and anything that ventures above the log is being nipped off by animals again, and low probability of this aspen being restored as a forest type unless protection is provided, as Wayne indicated. And finally, in the lower right-hand corner is an example where a mechanical treatment was attempted in a mixed conifer aspen community in attempt as a surrogate or substitute for fire. And again, the animal numbers were not controlled adequately, and aspen was lost. We're finding research is showing the importance of aspen as being in some of these mixed aspen conifer communities, that aspen is important for the establishment of the conifers. So again, we've lost the forest, and we've lost all the benefits of having a forest on this particular landscape because the improper treatment was applied without protection. What I'd like to say here is that climate can be important and other aspects can be important, but at least in the Western United States, the protection needed for establishment for the first 2 to 7 years for those suckers as they emerge after the fire is critical. And there are landscapes where the animal numbers are low enough that it's not a problem, but there's certainly plenty of locations where it can be a problem, and that has to be part of the overall plan of protection or plan of implementing a restoration process, is to be sure the protection is either through fence or by other means. Some of the things that have been used successfully to just rest from livestock use, to hold extra hunts, to reduce the number of wild ungulates, deer and elk that might be present, or combinations of management activities that can provide that protection. Ultimately, sometimes fencing is required. With that, I'd like to just kind of conclude that the importance when we are attempting to use fire over large landscapes. And I would say that managing aspen forests at the landscape level, large areas, for that fire or not using fire is not an option. We need fire. Fire is an important tool. It's not the only tool, but it's certainly an important tool. And Wayne's work shows how that can be done so well. But for that to happen, it's important to deal with the various publics, the different stakeholders and their views of the risks and concerns that exist. The value of creating collaborations where people of different interests and different values can sit at the same table and know that they have a voice in the decision-making process, that they can be part of the monitoring and celebrate the successes together, even though they don't always agree on all aspects of what will take place. We found that that kind of collaboration is critical to use fire at the large scale that it's needed in order to be successful. And always, we need to be prepared to adapt when a decision is made and an action is taken and we don't quite get the results that we were hoping for. We learn from that so that the next time we can do a better job.
Well, thanks, Wayne and Stan, for setting the table quite neatly. I just want to take a couple of slides here to take us into the future a little bit, and also highlight something that both Stan and Wayne have alluded to, is that these are dynamic systems, and it's not a one-time event where we take some action or we have a wildfire and we walk away, but they are very dynamic. And as we move into the future and look at scenarios of climate warming, how might we best manage aspen systems with fire in mind with a warming planet? I just want to quickly point out that the upper slide on the left there is average monthly temperature projections for the United States. Generally speaking, we are fairly confident in our modeling of temperatures. The lower left is a drought monitor or precipitation, and we have much less confidence in that. So we do suppose that temperatures will be warming. That will affect the amount of precipitation that comes in the form of rain versus snow and the amount of drought we have, but we don't have as good of a fix on, especially at specific geographic locations, how much precipitation we might expect. So that's a caveat for looking at the nascent or brand new science of trying to take aspen into the future with changing climate scenarios. In essence, we have two diverging scenarios here. The first is highlighted by a paper from Rayfelt and others that's documented in the upper right there. But basically, this is a climate envelope model, and we've all seen different versions of these with different vegetation and forest types. But in the current distribution, we see aspen all over the West, predominantly in montane situations. And as you progress through time to 2030 and then 2090, the area of aspen habitat shrinks through time. You take the habitat, you essentially put it in a figurative envelope and you move it forward through time. And we see a pretty severe shrinking of aspen habitat through time. So that's sort of the first approximation of what we might see with aspen moving into the future. What those folks did not really take into account is our prime subject today, and that's disturbances of various types. But one of the main ones affecting aspen ecosystems is fire, as Wayne and Stan so eloquently pointed out in the earlier presentation. And this scenario B, as I'm calling it, with the addition of fire, often leads to a prolific response from aspen, a lot of regrowth and suckers, in some cases actually expansion of aspen. So these two scenarios are somewhat diverging, and that's documented there by a paper published 5 or 6 years ago by Yang and others. One wild card here that we haven't talked about is true aspen seedlings, and we're finding those more and more now that we've developed an eye how to look for them. And lo and behold, they are predominantly turning up in areas that were recently burned. And so how will that affect aspen's sort of geographic health, expansion or contraction as we move forward? The early science says we don't really know. However, the overarching message here And Stan expressed it really well in terms of adaptive management. Part of adaptive management is learning as we're going through monitoring, but we also call this managing for resilience. I'm going to come back to that in a minute here as I go to the second slide looking at Aspen futures. This is a striking photograph of a fire in Alaska. Obviously, the fire does not respect boundaries. It doesn't respect our different scientific disciplines, and it doesn't respect what agencies we work for. The fire is going to burn, in this case, very intensely across these actual and figurative boundaries. And so, picking up on a theme of adaptive management that Stan expressed, if we work together more, and I mean more than in the past, we're going to have to really focus on this across agencies, across disciplines. For example, fuels management, ecology, silviculture, wildlife for sure, all of these different disciplines and more, and also across boundaries and ownerships. In the Western United States, we have a lot of public land, but we also have private land intermixed with that. And to be effective, we're going to have to bring these various partners to the table and actually listen to them and move forward with plans that are based on some action taking place, whether planned or a wildfire, and then monitoring it as we go. Ultimately, we're doing this for the future, is for our children or those coming forward, and for healthy ecosystems in the future. But I caution the listeners that in the scenarios of climate change, sometimes we get ourselves in a sense of despair. It's just too big, it's too widespread to actually do something. And that's the long-term sort of look at things. It's important that we combat climate warming through reducing our carbon. However, we need to push back on that despair and manage for resilience now through adaptive processes, through active monitoring, so that we have these healthy aspen forest ecosystems, in effect, living with fire in an effective way to be more resilient as we move into situations where we don't know exactly what the future will bring. With that, I would like to thank everybody for your patience and listening to our perspectives. And now we will pass the baton back to Steve and answer some of your questions and have a hopefully enlightening discussion about aspen and fire.
I thought it was an excellent presentation, and thanks to everybody. One question that I had when you showed the cross-section about the number of fires that occurred from 1740 to 1860, and the frequency was about 15 years. And then it pretty much stopped at 1860. And then there was one fire, I think, in 1934. Are there any other factors that you might consider other than fire that might have reduced the fire frequency? For example, weather factors, for example, grazing that was introduced about that time. I was just wondering if other than fire, there could have been other factors.
Yeah, very good question. Certainly, the availability of fuels to burn and ignitions are what's driving that high frequency of fire. And there's certainly not an agreement as far as what elements might have been most important, but these are lands that in the late 1800s, European settlers came in and began grazing livestock, been reducing the fine fuels and making fire less likely. It's also in an area that was very much used. It was a used landscape by the Paiute Indian tribe, and they were known for using fire as an important tool in managing their landscapes. So there was likely a reduction in intentional fires, at least in portions of the landscape. Both of those factors, and as well as periods of time when the climate was wetter and less likely to allow for drying of fuels, all of those intermixing likely affected the reduction of fire after around 1860. These particular lands in the example were private lands. They were not forest public lands, so they continue to this day to be managed by private landowners.
Yeah, I would just add very briefly that I have some data that shows it's actually based on tree ring data, but the 20th century was very wet in relative to the previous 1,000 or 2,000 years. And so that certainly is a big factor, and not to get into an argument about which is more important, but there were some really wet periods there and overall a very wet century. So the transition we're seeing now to dry should be also viewed in contrast to what we've just been through.
Paul, in the beginning, you kind of talked about like the specialty of aspen, like it's a more thin bark tree. and lots of birds or worms, they like them. Then you talk about like when fire take over and sometimes aspen would just probably get destroyed, then maybe take over by other conifers. So when that happens, how drastically the ecosystem would change.
And that's a complex subject, how to boil it down. So you're saying if an aspen system is completely converted to some other type of vegetation and some other forest vegetation? I'm not aware of a lot of instances of that happening, certainly not quickly, but over time we've had during this previously very wet and relatively sparse fire event century, we've had a lot of advancing succession, which both Wayne and Stan talked about. One of the main issues I've been working on is thinking about what species are lost, both plants and animals, when we make that conversion over time. Now, I really want to highlight that these systems are dynamic, and because they did that over the last century doesn't mean they will remain conifer dominated. As you saw with some of those dramatic crown fire pictures, there's a good chance that they, after those events, that they would return to aspen dominance, say, for the next century or so. I'm using rough numbers here. So I don't foresee quick conversions, even with climate change scenarios. And I do foresee that as we keep an eye on the ball, as we monitor adaptively, we can make some changes to make sure fire is on the landscape where it should be, and also make sure that the remaining aspen, sometimes just a few mature stems per hectare, are resprouting and not getting eaten all the time. And so maintaining that health that's hidden in the root system underground is pretty critical, even when it's at the very minimal level where there's just a few trees on the landscape. Those systems are capable of recovering perhaps a couple of rounds of fire or other disturbance. There's some really good science out talking about when repeat disturbance happens, even in the face of a warming planet, it actually advantages aspen and it rebounds quite nicely. I think all of us would agree that the protection aspect is so critical, and some of our landscapes simply have too many wild animals, finding these suckers highly nutritious and highly desirable. So I'm not sure if I directly answered your question, but I took my best shot at it.
I just add something, Paul, and that is, it's not like we have to have everything in one state, but as I was trying to indicate, if we can create landscapes with different patches of successional status, then the wildlife species that are dependent on aspen or any forest at different stages of succession, they can find that habitat that will work best for them if we have the right patchwork on the landscape, and that provides a more resilient landscape from a wildlife perspective.
You made a very strong case about protecting the areas after a fire in order to protect the aspen. But when you're dealing with thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of acres, and the regeneration is coming back, how do you protect that from the ungulates? And if you could define what an ungulate would be too.
I think the simple answer there is that the larger the fire, probably the less protection you will need, because there's more alternate forage for those animals. Now, I would say that these extremely large fires that we've been seeing in the last few years throughout the West, if aspen is present in any of those fire footprints, it's the one winner, if you will, that's coming out of this. And if you see these very large fires where seed sources are completely burned up, or in the case of returned fires, as has happened here in Colorado, where you're in lodgepole, which, you know, is a serotinous cone species that's supposed to come right back. But if you return fire and destroy a young stand before it is old enough to produce seed, then you've totally changed the landscape to a different successional pattern. But aspen universally is the winner in all of this because of the roots that are there. They sprout, and you wind up with more aspen in these larger fires. And when you have a large area burned, there's alternate forage for all the animals. And so I think aspen will persist better in these large areas. The crucial thing is where you have very small groves of aspen in situations that we know are on the edge of that climatic model where, you know, conditions are not going to be conducive to aspen in the future. Those are the ones we're liable to lose.
Yeah, just taking off on what Wayne was saying, this kind of all boils down to the numbers, the movement, and the area. If we change from the past, which many of us are well aware of, is that the animals do not move as much. They become sedentary because they are not afraid and or being reduced by predators. So we've eliminated many predators. So our modern predators are hunters or automobiles, and the numbers are generally too high, though, as Stan said, not in all places. And with livestock, it's a little bit easier to control the numbers and movement, but the numbers and movement's pretty critical. And then this idea that you can have disturbance large enough to sort of swamp the number of animals is logically true, but we haven't really done a good job of testing that. So it's an experimental, it's an experiment that's going to take place whether we want it or not. Ultimately, as I alluded to before, whatever happens, whether we do some management action or large disturbances, what happens next as managers, the adaptive part that Stan took on pretty directly, that's pretty crucial to all of this.
I'm actually just kind of wondering, who here on this call is working directly with managers and what does that look like?
Well, I've worked directly with managers a lot, both before and after I've retired. A lot of the examples I showed today were done in conjunction with commercial management activities, timber sales and other projects. That's where I got my treatments. I provided the monitoring, if you will, and got some research results out of it. So I've worked pretty closely with managers doing that.
I do, along with a lot of other helpers, professional workshops all around the Western states, and both Stan and Wayne have participated in those in the past. But not only professional managers, working quite a bit with private landowners as well, and wildlife managers, and trying to bring all these folks in a collaborative sense into the room at these workshops, because there's an up and coming issue with wildfire, certainly, and also with wildlife management, is cross-boundary management. That was the final slide I showed. Educating folks and getting everybody to focus on the problem rather than on our differences is quite crucial to, in my opinion, to working with folks with boots on the ground, whether they're professional managers or they're landowners or whatever their occupations or disciplines are.
For the last 10 years, I've worked with a group in southern Utah in an area where they had a number of failures in terms of trying to come together and develop a plan for treating aspen. It's on a mountain that has a lot of aspen there. And we formed a collaboration. My role was to provide science and interpretation of science, working with the National Forest Service, state agencies, various non-governmental agencies and interest groups, as well as private landowners. In that collaboration, we provided the information the federal agency, which was the primary landowner, needed to develop a plan for treating about 50,000 acres, so 20,000 hectares. It took about 5 years to get there. A lot of meeting, a lot of building of trust, spending time on the ground, looking at the problems, livestock issues and wildlife issues and so on. And in the end, we came up with a pretty good plan, I think, and we've been implementing that, monitoring as we go and making some adjustments.
When we do prescribe burning, is there any problem on live aspen on mortality? How do aspen respond to prescribed burning when you're trying to reduce your fuels?
It's amazing how light a fire can kill aspen. Paul made that point very well early on. And it doesn't take much to kill aspen. If you're not killing all the overstory trees, it's because you're not burning, you're not getting black, if you will, on 100% of the area. And a lot of these really cool fires burn on a small scale in a very patchy, irregular pattern. And so that's how some of those trees survive. But if you get fire, just a few seconds of flame around a mature aspen tree, it will die.
So what advice would you give a land manager in terms of trying to reduce fuels if there's an aspen stand?
In most cases, reducing fuels in a pure aspen stand isn't the problem. It's these late seral mixed stands like Stan described. And again, I've had experience in another part of Utah where it was a very extremely late seral stand and you were crawling over logs all the way through it. They tried to burn and got nothing because it wasn't a complete overstory burn. They weren't removing the conifers. They weren't getting sunlight to the soil surface. And they had these heavy concentrations of down logs that just cook the roots. And, once you do that, you're not going to get anything.
I should say on the other end of the spectrum, there's been a number of examples that I'm aware of in Utah where we tried to burn pure aspen and we couldn't even get a fire going. And generally speaking, all of that biodiversity and all that plant growth holds a lot of moisture. And only at a very brief window in the year, in a normal, whatever a normal year is it very flammable. So there's been a lot of failed experiments where we're out there with the drip torches. We didn't show pictures of all the failures.
I'm the one guilty of that.
Yeah, we couldn't get a fire to burn. And that it goes a little bit back to this old term, aspen being an asbestos forest. That's not entirely true, but there are many instances where it's difficult to get it to burn if there's not some conifer component in there.
Yeah.
Is that a mixed conifer you're talking about? What elevation are you talking about?
Well, these can happen at various elevations, particularly across Colorado and Utah, but there's specialty situations all across the West and well up into Canada where these more pure stands, there's no other tree species but aspen. It's not a mixed conifer. It's only aspen, and it's only aspen for generations of. So we don't expect a serial situation for conifers to come in. They're just difficult to burn. However, in rare situations, they do burn, so we don't have any absolute rules, but I do want to point out that there's some that don't burn well.
I might throw in too that one of the real bugaboos in using prescribed fire is getting the right conditions that you can burn. It's called the burning window, and it's extremely difficult to do that, especially near urban areas where smoke is a big problem, as Stan had mentioned. The last 3 years of my career, we were trying to do some small scale prescribed burning on the Manitou experimental forest, and we never got a burning window that we could do it in 3 years' time.
When you were doing your presentation, I think you talked about after the fire, when you guys try to restore aspen, you would use roots with siblings. And then you also mentioned earlier in the Q&A session that sometimes when it's burning in a larger area, sometimes aspen might have a better opportunity to grow back than other forests, if I understand it correctly. Is it because the specialty of aspen that it can like clone itself with this really special way of growing that it actually gives it more benefits to restore itself than other forests?
Well, that certainly is a great attribute of aspen, is having that ability to vegetatively regenerate. The issue comes, I think, with success is that it gets back to providing those conditions. If you have a larger area, you can get sunlight down to the soil surface better. You can provide alternate forms of forage for browsing animals in some instances. And so you just get a better result the larger area you can treat. But you can treat small areas too, and I have, but they have to be protected. The extreme example in my career was I resurrected a 2-stem aspen stand and turned it into a 1/4 acre forest in 20 years, but it's behind a fence in northern Arizona, and it's going to stay behind a fence because of the intense animal pressure.
What is the oldest aspen that you've ever found or that you know of?
Didn't somebody find a 330-year-old one? Wasn't that done in Utah State?
Yeah, the exact number doesn't come to mind, but somewhere around 300, give or take 25. And there's another old one over your way near Fort Collins, just a few years younger than that. That's actually a really great question, Jessica, because overall, on average, mature aspen don't live that long. Kind of mean age is probably between 80 and 120 years of age. I like to say that its partners, the conifers and the aspen, are dying and regrowing on really 2 different cycles. And aspen is turning over quicker, but it's good at dying, but it's really good at regrowing. And we're going to keep saying this over and over again, provided we have adequate protection, which is a major issue in the West these days. And it's an important follow-up to any time we talk about perturbing these forests, whether intentionally or unintentionally.
Well, I was just going to mention that the age of aspen, we're getting a turnover above ground, but we're also getting a turnover below ground because these roots, they replace themselves over time too. And because it requires some separation or death for these roots to be stimulated to sprout, there is one genotype in a large area like the Pando clone, undoubtedly. But what you really have is physiologically, you've got separate units of connected individuals out there, but the whole area is not physically connected and functioning as a single if you will, connected organism. The model I like to think of is strawberries. They vegetatively reproduce through runnering, and then the runner disappears over time. And so the individuals that are left there are genetically identical, but they're functioning physiologically as individuals. And you get this sort of mix within aspen stands. There are certainly groups of trees that are connected, but not all of them are connected.
It's fun to think about, how does this function? And there is no great answer, as an individual or as a community, because the interconnections are wide and varied. And as Wayne suggests, there's disconnections and then reconnections sometimes in root systems. We know almost nothing about what's happening underground. It's a very complex world under there in which we don't see well.
Well, I know from experience, it takes a tremendous amount of work to quantify the underground root system of aspen. I did that for my PhD, and Jim Worrell and I did that for the work we did in Aspen Decline. And it's a lot of work to sample below ground.
There are many trees that regrow vegetatively. However, in these aspen ecosystems that are dominated by conifers, there's few, if any, that are regrowing vegetatively. And that's why you hear the three of us really pointing out the uniqueness of that and the great advantage of that system having under fire scenarios of various types. But there are other trees that resprout vegetatively. There are few on the worldwide stage that dominate such large areas that grow over such varied conditions as the 6 or 7 aspen species circumboreally that grow back in that way and play such an important component in partnership with the various conifer species that they grow with.
Is aspen more resistant to drought than conifers? Or if there's a drought in an area that's a mixed conifer aspen mix, who comes out ahead on that?
Well, it's interesting you bring that up, because the work that Jim Worrell did in Aspen Decline in Colorado, and then Andrew followed up. Aspen is pretty sensitive to severe drought. That's what caused the Aspen Decline, was really the death of the roots, because there was such an extreme short-term drought in 2000, 2001 that the roots died, and then that caused the overstorage stems to die. What we were seeing when we were seeing these groves of aspen die above ground was just the culmination of losing the roots, because when you try to find live roots around these areas, you couldn't find them. So I would say aspen is pretty sensitive to extreme drought.
And that's tricky. And I would have a caveat on that in saying different geographic locations or different elevations, we might have a different reaction. In that same drought period, I believe Stan was with me, but we visited in one of our workshops in the Uintas, a ways north of where Wayne is talking about. And the drought seemed to have stimulated a strong response that was surviving well. They were about 2 meters tall when we visited them about 5 years after that drought. So that auxin cytokine reaction that Wayne talked about in his presentation takes place, but I think in some severe drought situations, and then also let's keep our eye on the ball in terms of browsers, there's a failure, there's a breakdown. Those marginal stands that are very low elevation or southwest facing slopes tend to be poorly affected, although we had a very similar situation in Utah in the northern part of the state, and it sprouted and did really well. So it's probably pretty place specific.
I would add to that, thank you, Paul, that oftentimes the effect of drought on aspen is to weaken, as is the case for other species of trees as well, but it weakens the tree, and it's an insect or a disease that causes the ultimate mortality. And in fact, oftentimes, and this was the case in the Uinta Mountains, that there was mortality in a number of stands that was timed to do with the drought, but was oftentimes insect or disease related. And then we had this very vigorous flush of root suckers that I went back actually about 12 years after the mortality took place, and thriving new young stands, expanding stands of aspen as though we maybe had burned them or had that kind of a positive response. That's not to say that there aren't situations where the drought is so severe that it doesn't have the effect that Wayne described. I'm not saying that at all, but maybe more often, perhaps, a drought might have an intermediate kind of effect of potentially similar to what a fire would do. And because older trees, particularly older aspen trees, are more susceptible to drought than younger trees. And if you've got a fairly old stand you could see a real mortality event take place that would allow for regeneration afterwards.
I've noticed that behind Paul and also on your slides, there's this organization called Aspen Alliance. Could you do like a short introduction?
This is a nonprofit associated with Utah State University. And basically, we do a lot of what we're talking about on this presentation is it's outreach and education and getting current research out to various interest groups, but primarily managers, researchers, managers, private landowners. And that's what we do. We're a clearinghouse of aspen management and research information. And both Wayne and Stan have had a hand in getting this organization off the ground. So if they look innocent.
When I was in the field in Western Colorado, when it came to managing aspen, sometimes we ran into the fact that it was like considered like a heritage concern. The aspen where we were, there was a lot of carvings on the aspen. You know, sometimes we couldn't do certain things because the carvings were like these came from the people who were grazing their animals, you know, over the years, and they'd be on their horseback and they sit there and they carve into the aspen, and then, you know, 50 years goes by and then it's considered a kind of a heritage artifact. Do you run into that in other places in the country?
Yeah, they're called arbor glyphs.
Yeah.
Arbor glyphs? Okay.
Yeah. There's actually a professor at Nevada, that's his research area, is trying to document arbor glyphs. He's published several papers on it.
Oh, that's interesting.
So just quickly, this is from Eastern Nevada. It's by the Basque sheep herders and it's 1930. It says Vive la France.
So cool.
Well, at least you didn't show the pornographic ones.
I was going to say, some are a little bit more risque than that.
Yeah, I took it easy on you. There are some that are, let's say, pretty detailed.
Yeah, no, I thought that was kind of interesting just working with the National Forest Systems. You know, we'd be trying to do some kind of timber sale or something, and then working with archaeologists, they'd have to come in and mark certain trees that needed to be protected. And just as much as like a wildlife specialist would have to mark a tree because it was important to some certain goshawk or something like that.
It's a cultural artifact like an arrow point would be on the ground or a pod or something like that. Yeah.
I was actually contacted, I think it was somebody from the Park Service, wanted to know how you could preserve those things. Well, the bark comes off of aspen within a few years after the tree dies. I said, I don't know, unless you would go out there and take a latex mold of it and then make a casting. That's about the only thing I can think of. So,
yeah, and incidentally, maybe some percentage, we don't know, of those that they did carve in turned out to be vectors for disease and they didn't survive. So we're looking at the ones that scarred over nicely and survived. But so generally, I think the three of us would agree that we don't really encourage folks to carve an aspen tree. It actually does kill the tree oftentimes.
they can. In fact, the reason a lot of those old ones survived is they didn't go through to the cambium. They just scratched the outside epidermis, if you will, of the aspen, and that caused the scar tissue formation, but didn't allow the diseases to get access to the cambium where it could kill the tree.
I'd like to thank Stan, Paul, and Wayne today for being our panel. And I certainly enjoyed all the information that I learned about aspen and fire. I hope you have enjoyed our presentation, and I sincerely hope you will tune in to other videos, 7 as of now, prepared by the International Wood Culture Society on various topics concerning fire in the West. The website link for these videos will be posted at the end of this video. Thanks for joining us today.